Donating healthy organs upon death has long been established to save the lives of those in need of transplants. The costs of donating organs at death are negligible, while the benefit of potentially saving the life of a stranger, or even a loved one, is quite significant. But some alarming statistics exist regarding the participation of eligible organ donors in different countries. 12% of eligible Germans are organ donors. 99.98% of eligible Austrians are organ donors. Are Germans inherently less altruistic individuals than Austrians? Probably not. Germany and Austria are neighboring countries with similar cultures that have similar values on human life. What, then, can explain such a stark difference between these two countries, and how can Germans raise participation? The answer lies with the default effect.
The default effect, a version of the status quo bias, is the psychological phenomenon where individuals prefer the current state of affairs and, when offered a choice to stray from this status quo, will often choose to do nothing and remain with the default option. A key study that helped illustrate the impact of the default effect was conducted in 1988 by William Samuelson. He took 486 students and presented them with a hypothetical situation in which they inherited a significant amount of money from their great-uncle that they were allowed to invest in 4 ways. In one type of test, one of the options was presented as the status quo, in which their uncle had already invested the funds. In this type, there exist 4 versions so that each option was presented as the status quo once. In the other type of test, the funds had not yet been invested, so no status quo had been designated. The researchers found that the status quo had a significant effect on these individuals' decision on where to invest. For each of the 4 options, participants were more likely to choose a plan if it was designated as a status quo than if it was a neutral option or an alternative to the status quo.
So how exactly did the default effect cause such a gap in participation between Germans and Austrians? The reason lies in the different policies that the two countries employ. In order to become an organ donor in Germany, you have to actively opt in to do so. That is to say, unless you take action, you will not be an organ donor. In Austria, an opt-out policy exists, meaning that unless you take action, you give presumed consent. Since these switching costs are low, a large part of the 87% gap reflects people sticking with the default option. Why exactly does the default option persist? There are several psychological factors underlying this overall impact. One explanation is the tendency for humans to conform to other people's expectations. This phenomenon is illustrated by an experiment done by Solomon Asch in 1951. To test the extent of the social pressure of conformity, Asch asked a room of 8 people to look at 2 cards and identify which lines on the cards were the same length. 7 of the people in the room were Confederates and had previously agreed on what their answers would be, while the 8th was uninformed about what was going on. Each person was instructed to say his answer aloud, with the uninformed participant going last every time. On 12 out of 18 trials, the Confederates gave an answer that was clearly wrong. Asch found that over 12 trials, 32% of participants conformed with the obviously incorrect majority, and 75% of participants conformed at least once. Afterwards, when asked why they conformed, participants said that they wanted to fit in and because they thought that the Confederates may have been better informed than they were. Conformity has its roots in human history because, as social beings, agreeing with groups was much more conducive to survival than was separating from the pack. The idea of conformity applies to the default effect because oftentimes, people go with the default because they view it as a suggestion to which they may conform. In the case of Austria, some people could see the default option as the government's optimal suggestion. By having to opt out, citizens see consenting as the government's prescription and consequently are more likely to be organ donors.
Another explanation for the default effect is the phenomenon of loss aversion, where individuals prefer to avoid losses rather than to acquire gains. A common example of this phenomenon is outlined in a study concerning insect pesticide that was said to harm 15 out of 10,000 people who used it. Participants were told that the ball cost $10, while the mean willingness to pay to eliminate the entire risk was $3.78. 77% of participants said that they would not buy the product if the risk increased by even one person out of 10,000. Clearly, people are more affected by loss than by gain.
This effect is readily apparent in the field of political elections. Despite the 10% approval rate of Congress before the 2012 midterm elections, 91% of incumbents up for re-election stayed in Congress. Why is there this disconnect between political mood and voting? While some can be attributed to partisanship and voter ignorance, the default effect, but specifically loss aversion, can explain a lot. Voters view the incumbent as the status quo, and the challenger as a new, novel option that can go one of three ways. He or she can be better, worse, or the same. Because individuals prefer loss to gains, voters fear that the new candidate will be worse, more so than they hold out the hope that he or she will perform better, leading to a distinct advantage for the incumbent candidates. This helps explain why Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry was re-elected after being jailed for crack cocaine use, and why Senator Robert Byrd managed to stay in Congress for 51 years to his death, despite being an ex-member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Currently, it is unknown which parts of the brain are directly involved in accepting the status quo. However, a recent study in 2010 by researchers at the University College London examined neural pathways while participants were involved in either accepting or rejecting the default. Participants hooked up to an fMRI were asked to make the line judgments in tennis, calling the ball in or out on the screen while holding down a default key. Each turn, the screen would indicate whether the default was in or out. To accept the default, participants merely had to keep holding down the button, whereas to reject it, they had to change the key that they were pressing down. The study found that 13 out of the 16 participants were susceptible to the bias, and that it often led to errors in making the call. Furthermore, the more difficult it was to tell if the ball was in or out, the more participants chose the default option. The fMRI results showed that when rejecting the default, the subthalamic nucleus, or STN, of the brain became active, which is a part of the basal ganglia that is hypothesized to play a role in action selection. The STN became more active as the decisions became more difficult to make, and was under more influence from the inferior frontal cortex in this scenario as well.
The default effect can be utilized in beneficial ways, one of which is called soft paternalism. In essence, by setting an optimal default option, you can nudge people towards what you believe is the best direction or action. Denmark has an extremely bad trash problem. In a recent study in Copenhagen, 1,000 caramels were given out on the street to one group of people, and the wrappers were tracked to see where they ended up. 1,000 caramels were given out to another group of people, except in this situation, green footsteps were stenciled on the street, leading participants to the nearest trash can. That is to say, the study presented the latter group with a default option, to follow the footsteps. By printing the footsteps, litter was reduced by 46%, even though no one specifically told these people to throw their rubbish away in a trash receptacle. Setting optimal defaults can have a large impact. It can lead people to save more for retirement, and it can also lead people to donate organs and save lives. The default effect is a psychological phenomenon that must be acknowledged to truly understand human decision-making. But at the same time, it can also be utilized to help us make optimal, rational choices and nudge our society in a better direction.